Okay, so this is the second phase of Healing Eve, which is knowing what happened during the solar era, the era of the Great Father. So this webinar will explore the next major phase in the evolution of human consciousness, the solar era. This era saw the emergence of what we call our conscious mind and ego from the matrix of instinct and the primordial soul in the period from 3500 BCE to the present day. It also saw the gradual fading or loss of the kind of consciousness that existed in the lunar era, which only survives today in the indigenous cultures of America and South America and Australia, as well as a few other places in the world. Now, there are 7 great cradles of civilization: Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, China, Mesoamerica, and South America, and Africa. And from around 3500 BCE, that is 5,000 years ago, we enter a totally different era, an era which sees the emergence of the conscious ego from the matrix of the primordial soul. And this whole era is about the gradual emergence of the individual from the collective life of the tribe and the development of what is called our conscious mind, as I said before. But it is also about a violent and traumatic separation from the deeper matrix of the psyche or soul, and a withdrawal of our relationship with nature, due mainly to the loss of the image of the goddess and the constant wars that were the main feature of this whole era. It is about separation and dissociation, duality and polarization. We are still locked into this duality, which originated in the separation of nature from spirit, and the drive for power and dominance replaced the older lunar emphasis on relationship with a harmonious cosmic order, a relationship that had been supported by precise astronomical observation gathered over millennia. During the solar era, the sun replaced the moon as the primary celestial image. And in the 3 Abrahamic or patriarchal religions, the Great Father replaced the Great Mother as the sole image of deity. Because of this, Western civilization developed on the foundation of a fundamental dissociation between spirit and nature, creator and creation, and between the masculine and feminine archetypes associated with these. This dissociation effectively destroyed the ancient shamanic understanding of the presence of spirit in the phenomenal world and opened the way to its ultimate exploitation. Instead of there being a marriage between them, the masculine archetype assumed a position of dominance in relation to the feminine one. Nature, soul, woman, matter, and body, the 5 aspects of the feminine archetype, were downgraded in relation to transcendent spirit, man, and mind. Now I'm going to try and show you this in a diagram because it helps to have a diagram. Is the right-hand part of the diagram shut off? Can you see the whole square or not?
Yeah, we can see the whole thing.
Oh, good, because I can't. It's cut off by pictures of you on the right-hand side, but never mind, then that's lovely. So there we have the lunar first phase, when the little tiny individual self, like a baby in the womb, was held within the Great Mother and the primordial soul. And then we come to the second stage, which is the solar second stage of separation and dissociation, duality and polarization. And if you look at the left-hand box, I've put the conscious mind and the primordial soul are growing apart. And in the right-hand box, cosmos, deity, and the world are beginning to be seen as object. We are no longer part of them. We're separate from them. So this was a huge change, a shift in our understanding of life. And here I've given you a diagram as best I can to show the tiny yellow bit at the very top is the bit that we call our conscious mind or our ego. And this was sort of emerging from the deep matrix of the deep blue section down at the bottom, emerging from the matrix of the primordial soul, from the collective unconscious, from nature, and with all the instincts that go with it, not only our own instincts, but the instincts of all the life on the planet, plant instincts, animal instincts, insect instincts. And beyond that is the cosmos. So we've left out a huge part of what we are by thinking that we only are that tiny yellow triangle at the top. So within us, the work of Stanislav Grof has shown this, within us are all the collective memories and primordial habits of the human, animal, and plant species, which, under certain circumstances, on psychedelic ingestion of substances, we can access those collective memories and primordial habits, which may be overwhelming for some, but may be illuminating for others, depending on what your structure is, as it were, your psychic structure is. So I hope this is clear, that we are identified with that tiny triangle at the top, and we know nothing about the personal life experiences we carry in our unconscious, going back to earliest childhood and even the experience in the womb, and then the deeper level of our whole human experience on the planet and the collective experience of life, really, since its inception, going beyond that even to the cosmos. So I hope that gives you an idea of how much we've lost. So I think I've just covered. Our problems today arise from the fact that over the last 4 millennia, our conscious mind, that tiny aspect of our total psyche, has become detached from the deeper matrix of the primordial soul out of which it has evolved. As time went on, the conscious mind became more and more inflated and omnipotent, and we can see this today. We have no conception of what we've separated from or what we've done to the earth, so to speak. So we've become inflated and omnipotent, and its detachment is now complete, and it no longer has any awareness of or relationship with the psychic depths from which it has emerged, no relationship with the nature or the cosmos. And like Icarus, if you know the Greek myth, it's flown too close to the sun. Do you remember what happened to Icarus? His wings melted in the warmth of the sun and he fell into the sea. And that was the end of him. So it's not a very good metaphor to use, but it's very apt, I think. So the development of the conscious mind in humanity as a whole can be recognized as the greatest evolutionary achievement of the whole solar era. But this achievement gradually opened a chasm between spirit, associated with mind, and nature, associated with body and matter. This whole process was closely tied into the invention of writing and the power that literacy gave to a tiny elite group of educated and very powerful males. Gradually, the mind assumed a position of dominance over the body, and man assumed a position of dominance over nature and woman. This 5,000-year-long process was, I think, largely unconscious, and we've still not emerged from its influence. I should say here that nobody can be blamed for this. You can't go back and blame individual people or individual cultures and say they did it, and that's why we're in the mess we are. This was a very, very gradual process in which people were living like we're living, in which they didn't realize what was happening. A few people did, but not enough to make a difference. So as I say, nobody can be blamed. You can't go back and punish. So the emphasis of this 5,500-year-long solar era is on the ascent to the sun, rather than on relationship with the earth and the cosmos, as in the earlier lunar era. It's about the rise of great empires, territorial conquest, and the control exercised by tribal leaders and kings and very powerful priesthoods. It's about outstanding individuals leading exploration and discovery, and the growing empowerment of humanity that these bring. It's about the quest for knowledge and understanding of the life in which all our lives are embedded. But its shadow aspect has been the sacrificial rituals of war, practiced on a monumental scale. Because the canvas of this era is so huge and so complex, I will look first at the rise of the great empires, which continues into our own time. You can see China, Russia, and America as rivals, great empires. Secondly, I will look at the two powerful mythologies or cosmologies that have dominated this era and their impact on human culture and civilization. And thirdly, I will look at the psychological aspect of the solar era and at the dangers of its unacknowledged shadow aspect in the interminable preparations for war and the sacrificial rituals that accompany it. So why did we lose touch with lunar consciousness? First of all, I think it was the invention of writing in Sumer, which made a huge difference to the way we perceived the world, because we didn't rely on memory. We relied on the written word, or began to rely on the written word, and that eventually led to the things like the Bible or the Quran, etc., which became absolute instructions, as it were, on how we were to behave. Then it was the rise of powerful priesthoods and religions, and the incursions of the Indo-European and Semitic tribes into the agricultural village communities of the Middle East. So they came from two directions. They came from the Mediterranean, the Indo-Europeans, and the Semitic tribes came up from Arabia into the area of the Middle East. And it was also the movement from the land into fortified cities and a huge growth of population because of agriculture and the increase of sort of people staying in settled places, not moving around all over the place. So that cities became, tiny villages became big cities, and soon they had great walls around them. And then they were guarded by armed men. And there would have been a huge population of young men who had nothing to do because they were no longer engaged in agriculture. And so they were co-opted into war, the creation of large armies, and the rise of the solar hero myth of the warrior leader. And that you can trace right the way through from Gilgamesh, who I'm coming to in a moment, to the hero leaders of the last war, whatever. And above all, the transition from Great Mother to Great Father and the loss of the connection to nature and the life of the earth. So these were all powerful influences on the reason why we changed our consciousness, why we saw things in a different way. So we come first of all to Sumer. I'm concentrating on Sumer because it really is easier to follow than the Egyptian history, although the Egyptian was going on at the same time. So we had cuneiform writing invented around 3400 BCE. And we had the creation of the large city-states with a ziggurat or temple at their center. And these began, not to begin with, but after a while, they began constantly fighting with each other as rivals. And each ziggurat had its own god or goddess and its own high priest or priestess. And the city of Uruk, which is illustrated above, or I think actually is, had enormous walls around it and about 40 to 80,000 inhabitants. And then, of course, the population grew after that. The solar era is a time of tumultuous social and political upheaval. Indo-European and Semitic tribes worshipping sky gods invaded the peaceful river valleys that for millennia had worshipped the Great Mother or Great Goddess. These warrior tribes had a terrifying impact on the settled communities they overran and destroyed. And wherever they went, they left a trail of devastation. They might be compared to the warriors of Islamic State today who have regressed to the behavior pattern of that far distant past. Vast numbers of former agriculturally based people began to move to fortified walled towns for protection that grew rapidly into large fortified cities. A largely egalitarian farming society was replaced by a new hierarchical patriarchal order which ruled from the cities. Colossal temple, with the rise of farmers were reduced to serfdom. With the rise of literacy in the priestly class, powerful bureaucracies emerged to govern these cities and later empires. And colossal temples were built like this stepped ziggurat in Ur. Kings appeared whose ambition was to create and rule vast empires. The Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and later the Greek and Roman and Islamic empires. Discoveries in astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and an incredible creative outpouring into temples and palaces, sculptures, and exquisite works of art of all kinds were promoted by the immense wealth of the rulers of these empires. But they were built on the sacrifice of the lives of millions of young men who had to face the terror of death by the sword, the scimitar, and the mace, as portrayed on the temple walls of Assyria and Egypt. This is the historical and social background to the change in mythology and the relationship between the masculine and feminine archetypes that was to have such a profound influence on the development of civilization and the relationship between men and women. Can you get the feeling of this immense change? Melting pot, really. So the solar era begins with the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the earliest hero myth and the story of an outstanding individual, a hero king. Gilgamesh was the fifth ruler of the post-flood of post-Diluvian dynasty of the city of Uruk, circa 2700 BCE. His mother was a goddess and his father a mortal king. This is the earliest story of a hero king and the heroic feats of an individual, if one excludes the legends of the god-men who helped to restart civilization after the two cataclysms that I spoke about last time. This epic marks the emergence of the individual from the tribal group, and it also gives the oldest account of the flood. That's where our knowledge of the flood comes from, the Epic of Gilgamesh. His story is a fascinating one and crucially important for understanding the change from the lunar to the solar era. Gilgamesh and his beloved companion, Enkidu, who was a wild man from the forest, set out to cut down the forest of cedars that belonged to the goddess. Gilgamesh is warned by the gods in a dream not to proceed with this heroic adventure because its guardian, Humbaba, that's Humbaba up on the right there, has been appointed by the gods to guard the great cedar forests of the Lebanon. But Gilgamesh defies the gods and with the help of Enkidu kills Humbaba and cuts down the forest of the goddess. Later, Gilgamesh also slays the bull of heaven, which may be a concealed astronomical reference to the change from the age of Taurus to the age of Aries. The goddess is outraged and curses Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and shortly after this, Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh bewails his loss. What is this sleep which holds you now? You are lost in the dark and cannot hear me. So Gilgamesh sets out on a long journey in search of the herb of immortality. On his way to the sacred mountain, he hears the story of the great flood from one of the two survivors of it, and learns that the goddess had caused the flood, and then deeply regretted what she had done. He is given the herb of immortality, but on his way back to his city, he loses it to a serpent, who snatches it while he rests by a pool. And he cries out in despair, "Is it for this that I have wrung out my heart's blood? I found a sign, and now I have lost it." The Epic of Gilgamesh is the earliest story of a heroic quest and the battle with a monster, and is possibly the original template for later solar myths. So can you see the change, the heroic individual, and the change in the image of death, that it's something final? He's lost his best friend, and he goes in search of him, and he goes in search of the herb of immortality, which in the earlier culture would not have had gone in search of, because it would have been there implicit in the lunar belief system. So it's quite a different feeling. So the goddess Inanna held a place of paramount importance in Sumerian culture, and also as Ishtar in the later Babylonian one. And this is an image of Inanna from about 2000 BCE, still associated with the lion underneath her feet, and the bird, the owls on each side of her, and the serpent on her headdress. That's a serpent headdress, each representing one of her three domains of sky, earth, and underworld. Notice her bird wings, her serpent headdress, and her large bird talons, and the owls and lions at her feet. It's an extraordinary composite image. She was worshipped as the moon goddess and also as Venus and the star Sirius, which was very important in both the cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt. I should say a word about the position of women in Sumer. To begin with, they could be priestesses, transact business, and own and inherit property. But in the Akkadian north of Sumer, which later became Babylonia and was invaded by Semitic tribes, woman's position deteriorated until she was no more than a chattel, subject under pain of death to the control of her father and husband. Women had to be fully veiled and couldn't leave the house unless accompanied by a male relative, a custom that has lasted until our present day in some Muslim countries, and now, tragically, in Afghanistan under the Taliban. Can you see how old this was? 4,000 years old, this practice, and it still exists? It's unbelievable. And it's all based on fear of women's power. The sacred marriage of goddess and god was the greatest ceremony of the year in Sumer as well as in Egypt. It symbolized the marriage of heaven and earth and was enacted sexually between the high priestess and the king of the city. The most beautiful poems celebrating this marriage come down to us from Sumer, and I put a lot of them in the Myth of the Goddess for those of you who might read that book. So this is very important. The sacred marriage was still the most important ceremony of the year. But now we get an image of Inanna as the goddess of war, and this is a huge shift of emphasis. This image shows the change in the role of the goddess as she is co-opted to support war and slaughter. The Babylonian goddess Ishtar says, "I will flay your enemies and present them to you." And look at the poor enemies, one with a chain around his neck and the other with a foot on his stomach. So this was the fate of prisoners. They had the most awful deaths, and thousands of them were killed in that sort of way. So the psyche was in conflict because spirit and nature, head and heart, conscious mind, and instinctual or primordial soul were becoming dissociated from each other. The inner dissociation within the psyche was soon projected onto the battle against external enemies in the world. Can you see how that could happen if the psyche is split inside, that it might project onto enemies and go in search of enemies? We see the rise of a succession of great empires from the time of Sagan of Akkad, circa 2300 BCE, until the present time, when the current great powers are still trying to create empires. War becomes endemic, promoted by warrior leaders intent on power and territorial conquest. The acclaimed heroic leader is the warrior who is able to defeat his enemies in war. Whereas the focus of lunar culture was on the alignment of the human community with the rhythm of the Earth's cycles and the vast living body of the cosmos, the focus of solar culture was on the acquisition of power and the desire to conquer, whether territory or tribal enemies. And as the Bronze Age progresses, a new thread enters the tapestry of human evolution. It is terror, not the terror of nature, but the terror of death by the hand of other human beings, and also fear of death itself, which is now final, terrifying, and absolute, without the promise of rebirth, as in the lunar era. This is terribly important to understand. The underworld becomes a place inhabited by demons and evil spirits. The lamentations that appear during the third millennium rise to a crescendo in the second and first, and bear witness to an ever-rising tide of barbarism which battered the walls of the cities, bringing death and slavery to thousands and mortal fear to all. The people looked to a strong ruler and an army to protect them. This was particularly true of Mesopotamia, but we also hear the same lament from Egypt. And there's one in Sumer, a lament from a woman who was either a queen or a priestess, who just says, "There's nothing I can do. The old era is over. I can't protect myself. The barbarians are here." and we're all going to be slaughtered. That's in the myth of the goddess. So King Sagan of Akkad was an extraordinary man and is the first ruler that we hear of who boasts of his conquest of all the land and the cities between the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. Look at that map on the left and see on the left, the black bit on the left is the Mediterranean, and the black bit on the right is the Persian Gulf. All that land in the middle was conquered by him. And that's divided into Sumer on the left and Akkad, which was the Babylonian part, or became Babylonian later on. So it was an enormous empire. And like Moses, he was said to have been found in a basket by a river by two women who rescued him. And his daughter Enheduanna was a famous priestess whose poems have come down to us from that ancient time. And I put those poems in The Divine Feminine, the book I wrote with Andrew Harvey. So this was, again, the hero king appearing. Now, I've lost my place here. The principal theme of the solar era introduced by the Indo-European invaders is the battle between light and darkness. This is a new myth, leading to the battle to conquer and subdue nature in the service of man. The feminine archetype associated with nature and the goddess is split off from spirit. So nature and the earth are no longer sacred like they were before. And man becomes identified with spirit, and woman is identified by him, not by herself, but by him, with nature. So this is terribly important. Man thought, well, I'm going to identify myself with spirit, not with nature, and I'll identify woman with nature because she's beneath me. So that's how it happened. It's so clear in the descriptions of what happened then. So we come to this famous epic, Babylonian epic, which was called the Enuma Elish. It was recited annually for 1,000 years at the spring equinox in Mesopotamia. It's a creation myth that tells the story of how the god Marduk defeated the mother goddess Tiamat. He cut her body in half and made the heavens from one half and earth from the other. He then made humanity from the blood of Tiamat's murdered son. The violent imagery of this myth reflects the violence in that society and endorsed it as a pattern to emulate, because if the god could do that, well, man could do the same. It exalted the dominance of the god over the goddess and the male over the female. Now we come to Hammurabi, who I'm sure you've heard of, Hammurabi receiving the laws from the god Shamash in 1754 BCE. Soon after this myth of Marduk and Tiamat came into being, Hammurabi created his code of laws, and he receives them from a god, no longer from a goddess, as in Sumer, where the goddess Inanna was guardian of the laws of civilization, which were known as the May. So there's a complete switch of archetypes here. The goddess is not the one who gives the laws, it's the god who gives the laws now. Now, I've given you some maps for a few sessions here. We've got the early Babylonian Empire rising out of the Persian Gulf, and the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which are Iraq today. That's the same area as Iraq. And wait a minute now, Babylonian Empire, yes. And then on the right, we have the Assyrian Empire above the Babylonian one. And down at the bottom, we have Egypt. So in 721 BCE, 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel, taken from the northern province of Samaria, that's in Palestine. There were two provinces, the southern one of, southern one of Judea and the northern one of Israel. And they took the northern 12 tribes and they disappeared. They were taken into captivity, and they were never heard of again. Thousands and thousands of people were never heard of again. Nobody knows what happened to them, whether they were murdered or whether they went further east. Some people said they went to India, but nobody knows. This is the first example of ethnic cleansing. In 586 BCE, the first temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians, and in 597, the Babylonian captivity of the Jews took place. So you can see what a horrendous upheaval there was in this area of the Middle East. But it was also taking place in India, probably in China also, but I haven't time to go into those. And this gives you an idea of the magnificence of the Assyrian Empire and the buildings that have been in reconstruction of what they look like from the ruins of these colossal buildings. And you can see the inflation, if you like, of these rulers as they lorded themselves over the people that they conquered. And this is the Persian Empire at its height under Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, which reached as far as the Indus Valley. Do you see on the far right, the river, if you can faintly see it, the Indus River? And I mean, a colossal area that Cyrus ruled, going down into Egypt and up into Greece on the left. He was a wonderful ruler, actually. He was quite extraordinary. As rulers go, he was exceptional. And it was he who released the Jews and said, you can go back to your homeland. I won't keep you prisoner anymore here. So I said he was an extraordinary and an enlightened ruler. There's a wonderful book called Europe's Debt to Persia, which is huge, about 1,000 pages. But if you want to know about Persia, that's the book to read. Now we come to the colossal Roman Empire, even bigger, the whole of Europe, and right through again to on the far right, and the whole of the North African coast. It was destroyed by the barbarian invasions in 480 of CE, but it was enormous and minutely and efficiently controlled throughout its vast reach. In all these centuries of kings boasting of their territorial conquests and the building of giant empires, we hear very little about the suffering generated by these conquests, the weeping widows, the mothers who lost sons, the raped women, the orphaned children, and the crops and patterns of sowing and harvesting that were devastated by the foraging armies passing over them, the sacked cities and the exquisite works of art pillaged and looted. The long chronicle of conquest and human sacrifice which continues today, and the drive for power and the subjugation of enemies might truly be named the dark shadow of the solar age. We are still locked into this mythology of conquest, supremacy, and human sacrifice. I may say that there were tens of millions of slaves taken by all these conquests, and the slaves became the servants of these conquerors. 10,000 slaves a day were sold on the Greek island of Delos at the time of the Greek Empire, which is just part of the tragic story, really. So turning to Greece, the shamanic wisdom of the pre-Socratic philosophers that I spoke of last time seems to have vanished, although Parmenides was the teacher of Plato. Plato's philosophy underlies the philosophical tradition of Western civilization, as Aristotle's philosophy underlies the later development of science. Unfortunately, Plato's conception of the word nous was interpreted by future philosophers to mean mind, and even rational mind, rather than a subtle faculty of perception, which can apprehend archetypal ideas and concepts, which are noetic rather than material, a faculty that has to be cultivated and developed. Later, this faculty of deeper insight or perception would be called gnosis. Plato's concept of the soul as a divinely created single living creature that encompasses all the living creatures that are within it was lost with the increasing emphasis on mind. Now in Greece, Zeus and his two brothers Poseidon and Hades take over the former domains of the Great Mother, the sky, the sea, and the earth, and the underworld. Gaia remains goddess of earth, however, and Athena, Artemis, and Persephone become daughters of Zeus, although they are still great goddesses in their own right. But you can see the subtle way in which this was imposed, that Zeus is there, but he's the primal generator, if you like, of these daughters, Athena, Artemis, and Persephone. They're no longer really goddesses in their own right, although they're still called that. And we come to the myth of the solar hero, which was another of the primary myths of that time. And we hear about the Greek hero myths. We hear about Perseus slaying the Gorgon on the left there, Theseus slaying the Minotaur, Jason seizing the golden fleece from the great dragon beneath the tree of life, and Apollo slaying the she-dragon at Delphi, who was guardian of the sacred spring there. So this is all actually images of, not all actually, but slaying the Gorgon. The Gorgon was an image of the old goddess, and so was the she-dragon at Delphi. They're fascinating stories. I used to love them when I was a child, but they're all part of this change into solar mythology. So we come to the hero myth, which is shown in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Achilles and Odysseus are prototypes of the solar hero. And that book was read by millions of people when they could read. And of course, we probably teach it to our children. I know my daughter had it for her exam. She had the Odyssey when she was 15. And but she couldn't really comprehend what it was all about. She was too young. So what does the myth of the solar hero tell us about ourselves? This myth reflects an immense change in human consciousness and the formulation of an entirely new perception of life, one where man aspires to be in control of his destiny, where the emphasis is on the outstanding male as the carrier of the advance for the human race. One of the most important features of the solar era is the differentiation of the individual from the tribal group. Through his prowess as a warrior, he dons the mantle of the solar hero. His deeds are sung in the courts of kings and in the marketplace of cities. So there are two famous books that set the scene for the emergence of the individual, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Achilles and Odysseus are really prototypes of the solar hero, whose prowess in battle is legendary. So all these hero myths and stories gave young men a model to copy, and all suggest that men had to face and overcome the power of the instinct to paralyze with terror, as in the famous story of Theseus and the Minotaur, or Perseus and the Gorgon. This is what men had to overcome, was the terror of death when they went into battle. And it was something that strengthened them, but at the same time fixed them in the image of the solar hero and of the warrior. That was what they all aspired to be. And those who couldn't be warriors were kind of left at home and probably became the artists and the sculptors who gave us the treasures that we admire so much today. So now we come to the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, late in the 356 to 323 BCE. And you can see again the extent of his vast empire, which went right as far as Afghanistan. We see an outline of America, if you can pick it out, laid over the territory that was conquered by him. Until his early death, Alexander the Great was absolutely driven by the desire for conquest that led him through Persia as far as Afghanistan, where there are still children who are named after him. History doesn't tell us what his tutor Aristotle thought of his astonishing life path, but we know he slept with a copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle close to his bedside. The beautiful funeral wreath was his father's, Philip of Macedon, who was murdered at his daughter's wedding. Alexander's grave has never been found, but Philip's grave at Vergina in northern Greece is astounding for the magnificence and fine workmanship of its grave goods. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's extraordinary. It's been built wonderfully by the Greeks underground, so you're in black darkness, but all the objects are lit up in boxes all around the sides of this cavern that you go into. And they're unbelievably beautiful with a huge amount of gold and beautiful decoration. We do not hear the voice of women throughout this long era, save in the plays of the great Greek tragedians. In Euripides' heart-wrenching play, The Trojan Women, we can listen to what women suffered during these 5,000 years. The fate of women whose men had lost in battle was to be raped and sold into slavery, and their male children murdered, as Andromache's young son was flung from the walls of Troy. We can see this archaic pattern being acted out in Syria and Iraq today, in the enslavement and rape of the Yazidi women and the beheading of enemies by the warriors of Islamic State. Raped, orphaned, and widowed in ceaseless conflicts, women lost generation after generation of their sons, brothers, and fathers, as these were conscripted to fight ongoing territorial wars. Not much has changed in 5,000 years. The suffering of men was as great as the suffering of women, as millions died on the battlefield of their wounds. This needs to be remembered because women may tend to underestimate the suffering of men. As I've said before, the primary theme of solar mythology is the battle between good and evil, light and darkness. This theme originated in Persia with the great sage Zoroaster and is reflected in this 15th century image of the solar hero killing a dragon by Pisanello. It is a myth that polarizes and divides. It is this myth that still unconsciously drives the battle to conquer and subdue nature in the service of man. Despite its huge cultural achievements, and they are huge, this 5,000-year-long era has been dominated by conquest, territorial expansion, and the creation of gigantic empires, culminating in the situation we face today in the Middle East, with millions of refugees seeking safety in the West, their homes and livelihoods destroyed. But this myth, this same myth of the hero and the dragon and the battle between light and darkness, also describes humanity's immense evolutionary task of bringing human consciousness from a state of virtually unconsciousness or darkness to the fullest development or state of enlightenment of which it is capable. I'm speaking about the solar era here, not the lunar era. Through eons of Earth time, we can now trace the story of the evolution of life on this planet, our own separation and emergence from the matrix of nature, and our arduous quest for greater understanding of life and ourselves through search, suffering, and heroic endeavor. It was the role of the Buddha, Christ, and the other great teachers of humanity to help raise human consciousness to the enlightened state of cosmic consciousness. The Buddha lived at the same time as the pre-Socratic philosophers of Greece. I love that picture on the left of the Buddha sitting on the great coils of the serpent. That is a serpent goddess, Musalinda, by the way, who is protecting and blessing him and giving him the seat to sit on. Now I come to the second myth of the solar era, which is the myth of the fall of man. This dominated Christian civilization until 200 years ago and still influences us today. The myth of the fall of man originates in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. For 2.5 millennia, it has been interpreted as literal fact and as divine revelation. It became the foundation of Christian doctrine and was presented as the reason why we needed the sacrificial death of the Son of God to ensure our salvation. So in this myth, the image of deity is finally changed to the Great Father. Divine immanence is lost. The emphasis is on the total transcendence of God or spirit. Earth becomes a place of exile and punishment for primordial sin. Man is given dominion over the earth, but he is no longer part of the divine order. He is exiled to a world that is contaminated by the fall and subject to sin, suffering, and death. If we look at the myth of the fall from the perspective of the evolution of consciousness, the whole myth could be read as a metaphor that describes the birth of self-awareness and our separation from the matrix of nature, the Garden of Eden out of which we have evolved. But the radical change of consciousness which it reflects tore us out of nature and led to pathological symptoms of anxiety and the compensatory desire for power and security resulting from a profound experience of dissociation, separation, and loss, symptoms similar to those of a child who has lost its mother. We lost the feeling of connection between ourselves and an invisible ground of spirit, active and present within the visible world. And we lost the sense of kinship with all creation. I wonder also whether the Garden of Eden wasn't a memory of the pre-cataclysmic world that we lost so suddenly and catastrophically in the great flood that destroyed Atlantis. It's possible. Now, the effects of these two polarizing mythologies, the battle of light against darkness and the myth of the fall, were that the feminine archetype, which embraced nature, soul, body, and matter, was split off from spirit. Nature and the earth were no longer sacred. Nature was effectively desouled or desacralized. Man was identified with mind and spirit, and woman was identified with body and nature. I've repeated this because it's so important from what I said earlier. Woman became subject to man, giving rise to the misogyny that still afflicts us today. And body was split off from mind, and mind from soul. After 418 of the Christian era, church doctrine taught that sexual intercourse was transmitted the original sin of the fall. According to the teaching of St. Augustine, original sin was transmitted like an incurable virus through the sexual act. Adam's sin had corrupted the whole of nature and made it subject to death, but the entire sorry story was initiated by Eve. This unbelievable idea was incorporated into church doctrine. And can you imagine what this did to the sexual relations between man and woman? If they thought each time they had sex that they were transmitting the myth of the virus, really, of the fall of man. It's ghastly. You wouldn't believe that people could think up these things, but they did. If you read the documents of the early Christian church, they're absolutely full of this guilt of the sin of the fall. So Christianity from the 4th century destroyed many of the great temples and works of art of the pagan world, much as Islamic State has destroyed the buildings and sculptures of Palmyra and Mosul. In the 4th century, the Christian emperors Constantine and Theodosius burned as many of the Gnostic Gospels as they could lay their hands on. Fortunately, in 1945, a discovery at Nag Hammadi in Egypt restored many of these Gnostic texts to us. They contain much of the teaching of Jesus that was not included in the New Testament. And they really contain the idea of what gnosis was, this insight into a deeper level of reality. The destruction of the great temple of Eleusis and the closing of the Platonic Academy in Athens were ordered by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century CE. Fortunately and amazingly, the teachers from the academy were invited by the king of Persia to teach in a Persian university near Basra, bringing with them the priceless manuscripts of the Greek philosophers. These were translated into Persian, and after the Arab conquest in the 7th century of Persia, into Arabic. And they were taken eventually to Toledo in Spain, which was part of the Arab conquest, and were translated there into Latin in the 11th century, eventually reaching the great scholars of Paris and Chartres, and leading ultimately to the Renaissance in Italy. It's an amazing story. If it hadn't been for that Persian king, the Greek text would have been lost forever. It's just amazing. I think that the universe must have had a hand in it there. Now, on top of Alexandria, there was a hill with a temple on the top called the Seraphim. And this was set on fire by a Christian mob around 381 CE. And that fire from that temple at the top spread to the great library in Alexandria, which was absolutely extraordinary, with thousands and thousands of texts and rolls of papyrus from the old world of Greece and Egypt. And they were all totally destroyed. So we lost the complete inheritance, really, or heritage of the ancient world of Egypt and Greece in that terrible, terrible fire. There was a brilliant young woman philosopher called Hypatia who taught philosophy in Alexandria until she was horrifically murdered by a Christian mob who couldn't bear the thought of a woman teaching philosophy. Unbelievable. She was a wonderful woman, very beautiful and extremely learned, learning from her father, who was also a philosopher. And as I said, she was brutally murdered by a Christian mob of monks, I think. Now we come on to the important church council, perhaps the most important church council of 325 at Nicaea, during the rule of the Emperor Constantine. And at this conference or council, Jesus was declared to be of the same substance as God, and therefore the Son of God. This is the council at which he was made the Son of God. His body came from the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary, and his spirit came from God, or the Holy Ghost. He had to be immaculately conceived and celibate in order to be free of the taint of original sin. At the same council, the Holy Spirit that had always been feminine in the past and in the Old Testament was declared to be male, part of the male Trinity. So in this way, the feminine was eliminated from the Godhead. That particular time was a disaster for the feminine. I may say that there were two groups in this conference, one who were the supporters of Arius and the others of Athanasius, two different groups, and they fought it out physically, giving each other great blows and kicks, fighting with each other for which was going to win, because the Arians didn't believe that Jesus was of the same substance as God, and whereas the Athanasians did. So anyway, the Athanasians won, and that was the Arius died about a year later, and that was the end of the Arian heresy. But in 591, Pope Gregory the Great declared Mary Magdalene to have been a whore and a sinner guilty of all the sins. And this effectively buried the fact of her marriage to Jesus. That was another thing that the church did, a terrific harm. So I'm skipping rather over great centuries here, but the quest for the Holy Grail in the 12th century was, in fact, an attempt to restore the image of the feminine aspect of deity as the Holy Spirit. It was related to a new church of the Holy Spirit in the Languedoc area of France, which challenged the Catholic Church in Rome and claimed to have the original teaching of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. But, of course, this aroused the wrath of the church in Rome, which initiated a huge crusade against that area of France, and over 1 million people died, and the church was wiped out on the surface, but it still continues to the present day. So we come to Chartres and the building of the great cathedrals from the 11th, 12th century. This was the age of the building of the great cathedrals, all named as in honor of the Virgin Mary, but also secretly in honor of Mary Magdalene, the wife of Jesus, Our Lady. They were both Our Lady. The Crusades, awful as they were, had initiated an age of exploration and discovery, and Muslim craftsmen came to France to work on the windows of Chartres. And strangely, even the three entrance portals of Chartres have the pointed shape of the doors of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So they must have had quite an influence, and they weren't treated badly by the people who built the cathedrals, who were the Knights Templar, by the way, who financed them. They were treated well and welcomed, really, as very skilled craftsmen. Now, the Greeks, the Persians, and the Romans were largely tolerant of other religions. Southern Spain, under Muslim rule from the 7th to the 11th centuries, was tolerant of both Christians and Jews. It was an extraordinary civilization, the Muslim culture in Spain. Wonderful. The Alhambra, I don't know if any of you have visited it, but that was the creation of the Muslims in Spain at that time. But what happened in 1492, Boabdil, who was the Muslim ruler of Granada, surrendered to Ferdinand and Isabella, who were the Christian rulers of northern Spain. And strengthened by this final defeat of the Moors and under the pernicious influence of the Inquisition, in the Treaty of the Alhambra, 1492, they decreed that all practicing Jews would have to leave Spain within 4 months. Those who remained and didn't convert to Christianity were burnt at the stake and their property confiscated. I thought you should know these things because it's not something you'll ever learn in school or even university. So here we have 100 years later, the Moriscos, or descendants of the Muslims, were expelled. These two expulsions were a fatal mistake and have led to the huge problems that we face today. The injustice and cruelty of the Moorish expulsion was never forgotten. The call in 2014 of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the late leader of Islamic State, to create a new caliphate was partly to avenge the expulsion of the Muslim population from Spain in 1609. And these two pictures show boats taking these wretched people away from Spain forcibly. You can't really see the force, but this was what was pictured at the time. Now we come to the age of the great explorers of the 15th and 16th centuries, which opened up the world to Europe, which engaged in trade with these distant places. But this soon led to the desire to control these places as colonies and to the rise of the powerful empires of Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands from the 16th century. China and Japan resisted the attempts of the Europeans to create colonies. So we have Columbus and we have Magellan's voyage around the Cape Horn to the East Indies. Extraordinarily brave men and extraordinary journeys and discoveries, but they led to these empires. The conquests of Spain and Portugal in South and Central America led to appalling crimes committed against the people of these countries. The attempt forcibly to convert them to Christianity and the stripping of vast quantities of gold from their sacred buildings and treasuries to send back to Europe in galleons laden with loot. The European Christian monarchs who promoted the discovery, invasion, and colonization of the Americas were supported in their genocide by what is called the doctrine of discovery/domination that was issued in several papal bulls from the Vatican beginning in 1493. The Inquisition was imported into these countries, and many people were burnt at the stake. This was indeed the dark shadow of Christianity. It's unbelievable that they thought that this was the right thing to do. What happened to the teaching of Christ about love and compassion? It just was completely buried in this lust for power and wealth. So we come to Florence in the 15th century. when a new era began in Renaissance Italy with Copernicus' great discovery of the heliocentric nature of the universe, the translation of the Hermetic and Platonic manuscripts by Marsilio Ficino, the awakening to the beauty of the body in painting and sculpture under the influence of return to Greece, discovery of the beautiful Greek statues, the influence of Kabbalah and alchemy, and the work of an extraordinary group of supremely gifted architects, writers, painters, sculptors, and poets. These brought brilliant light into Europe after what had been a dark age of persecution in the 13th century, followed by the Black Death in the 14th, which killed a third of the population of Europe. In 1486, Pico de la Mirandola, or Mirandola, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, only 23 years old, gave his great oration on the dignity of man, makes me cry, before a prestigious gathering of philosophers invited by him to Rome. And in it, he offered a new image of man and the choice before him. And this is part of what he said, speaking as if with the voice of God. What courage! The nature of all other beings is limited and constrained within the bounds of laws prescribed by us. But thou, constrained by no limits, in accordance with thine own free will, in whose hand we have placed thee, shall ordain for thyself the limits of thy nature. We have set thee at the world's center, that thou mayest from thence more easily observe whatever is in the world. We have made thee neither of heaven nor of earth, neither mortal nor immortal, so that with freedom of choice and with honor, as though the maker and molder of thyself, thou mayest fashion thyself in whatever shape thou shalt prefer. This was an incredible statement to make at that time in the face of the Inquisition and the Catholic Church. It was a gauntlet thrown in the face of the Vatican because it challenged the whole concept of the powerfulness and sinfulness of man offered by the Christian Church. And Pico died in 1494 in his early 30s, possibly murdered by the Vatican. In fact, I'm quite sure he was murdered by them. Now, the image of the Virgin Mary in countless marvelous paintings of this time held the image of the feminine for this extraordinary cultural renaissance. And the story of Jesus and the birth of Jesus and the role of the Virgin Mary was painted over and over and over again by the most gifted and marvelous artists, enough to make you weep with the beauty of these paintings. I first saw them when I was 15, when my mother took me to Italy on a journey. And I was just amazed. That was my opening to art, really. And we went to the great cities to see the museums there, and this particular one, I remember. So that was the contribution of the Renaissance. And then we came to the Reformation and the 30 Years' War in Germany, when the vicious hatred between Catholics and Protestants, which stemmed from Luther's revolutionary action in condemning the Catholic Church for its venality and corruption, and launching the new religion of Protestantism, unleashed a terrible war in Germany in which a third of the population was killed or died from disease and starvation. Out of this horror came the Enlightenment of the 18th century and the movement away from religion to science. People were really revolted by the horror of that time. So we carry within us two kinds of consciousness, two ways of knowing. The lunar way, an instinctive, participatory, relational way of knowing, mediated through the heart and the right hemisphere of the brain. And the solar way, a rational, linear way of knowing, mediated through thinking and the left hemisphere of the brain. This is very important because the right and the left hemispheres think differently. One thinks imaginatively, and the other thinks more in a sort of bureaucratic way, in a linear way, from one thing to another. And that's the brain that we get bogged down in with the survival instincts of the ego. because the ego is frightened because of the survival programming, really, that it's had. And it says, if I don't do this, that's going to happen. And that's the linear thinking. And it forgets the imagination about everything being possible, everything being created anew. That has been overlaid by the left hemisphere. So an unconscious conflict developed in us as the solar way of knowing was superimposed on the lunar way, and the linear thinking of the left hemisphere gradually became dominant, and we lost all awareness of the sacredness of the life of the earth and the cosmos. And this inner conflict was projected into all the conflicts in the world over the last 4,000 to 5,000 years. There was a wonderful book by a man called Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist, called The Master and His Emissary. But he's just written a new book in 2 volumes, which will cost a fortune. But for those of you who want to read something really, really interesting, get that book. I can't remember its name, but it's coming out this month. Ian McGilchrist is his name. The increasing autonomy of human consciousness resulted in a growing sense of separation from the natural world and the conviction that man had the right to master and control nature and the world for his own benefit, nothing to do with the benefit of other species. The shadow side of this has been the rituals of sacrifice enacted by all civilizations in the world. None of them are exempt. From their inception, the 3 patriarchal religions eliminated the image of the goddess, as well as all traces of animism, or the belief that spirit was present in the forms of the natural world. All identified spirit with a wholly transcendent monotheistic concept of God. And in these patriarchal civilizations, woman was banished from her ancient role as sibyl, priestess, and prophetess, and her voice was silenced until 100 years ago. Now, the Christian story began to fade in the 18th century, and a new story came into being in a time called the Enlightenment. We lost the older participatory relational way of knowing and placed all the emphasis on the discoveries of science and the rational mind. Now, the discoveries of science were incredible, so they shouldn't be taken lightly. I mean, the geological ones, the cosmological ones, the biological ones, they're all extraordinary, as well as all the technology that has made our life much more pleasant with light and heating, etc. So now I've lost my place again. Yeah. We lost the older relational way of knowing and placed all the discovery on the emphasis of discoveries of science and the rational mind. And the mind began to take primacy over the heart. The influence of Descartes was hugely important. Descartes lived in the 17th century, and he put all this emphasis on mind and the human mind. So a radical imbalance developed in us as the new way of knowing was superimposed on the older way, and the so-called rational mind became dominant. Remember that triangle that I showed you in the beginning? With the rapid rise of an industrial society, we lost the older participatory awareness of the sacredness of the life of the earth and the cosmos. So we come to the current story, which is called Scientific Materialism, or Physicalism is its latest title, which I hadn't heard before. So this is what it says, and this is what's been taught in our schools and universities. The creation of the universe began with the Big Bang. There is no scientific evidence for God or the soul. Life, in the words of Yuval Noah Harari, life has no script, no playwright, no producer, and no meaning. We are alone in a vast, uncaring universe that is without life, meaning, intelligence, consciousness, or purpose. It's really incredible that this thinking could come into being, but it has. And it's very, very powerful because it controls all the scientific organizations in the world and the universities. The 4 basic tenets of scientific materialism or physicalism are these. The physical material universe is the only one that exists. The whole universe is basically a lifeless mechanism. It has no conscious beings in it apart from ourselves. We are separate from the life around us, from the life of nature and the life of the universe, both of which are unconscious or have no consciousness. Consciousness begins and ends with the physical brain. So when the brain dies, consciousness ceases to exist. There can therefore be no survival of the soul. This materialist story does not tell us who we are and why we are here on this planet. It does not tell us that the life of this planet has a deeper meaning and that our lives are of infinite value. It does not connect us to anything or anyone beyond ourselves. Is it surprising that so many people are showing symptoms of mental illness and are driven to drugs and suicide because their life has no meaning and no value? And this, of course, is promoted by things like Facebook. All of social media is absolutely permeated, saturated with this way of thinking. It has no moral values whatsoever, and it's destroying the lives of our children. Those of you who have children should be very careful about what they see. So where is the meaning of life in this story, other than the struggle for survival, competition, and the relentless struggle for power over others? It has led to the belief that we can control nature to our own advantage, even to the splitting of the atom and the creation of our demonic weapons of destruction, which can wipe out millions of people in a second. Seeing all aspects of the world and the universe as separate from ourselves and devoid of an inner life or consciousness has led to a catastrophic loss of soul and a loss of relationship with the planetary environment. The dehumanizing materialist view provides no foundation for moral values in society. The rational mind has replaced God. Science and technology are dreaming of unimaginable power over life, but they have no ethical boundaries to restrain them. This is a drawing by my husband. What does this materialist dogma do to our heart and our soul? It stifles their voice, the voice of feeling. Now we are faced with the effects of our alienation from nature. We have lost the relationship with the earth and the cosmos that millennia ago we had. We have lost all awareness that we live in a sacred order. If there is a single idea that is enabling and driving the destruction of the earth, it is the conviction that the earth has no consciousness, that it is not a conscious entity. So we have Sir David Attenborough warning us and saying the Garden of Eden is no more. We have changed the world so much that scientists say we are in the new geological age, the Anthropocene, or the age of humans. Human beings have overrun the world. We are the most dominant and populous species on Earth. Our effect on the natural world has been catastrophic. The speed of change on our planet has been more rapid than at any time in the last 10,000 years, and the threat to it has never been greater than it is today. Thank God we have a man like him speaking up, who has the authority, because of his life experience, to speak to us in this way. Only the indigenous people, with their ancient shamanic traditions, have maintained a relationship with both the earth and the cosmos, particularly with the earth as mother. Only the indigenous cultures kept the older story alive, the story of life on this planet as a sacred order, and our relationship with the earth and the cosmos as a sacred trust. For decades, they have been calling out to us to look at what we are doing to the earth and to leave the unconscious path we are on. Shamanic traditions and practices going back some 50,000 years or more were based on the experience of the heart, experience mediated through feeling, not the knowledge of the mind alone, to which we have mistakenly given priority. Through this long experience in many different indigenous cultures, as well as in the highly developed civilizations, such as those of Egypt and Greece, it was known that we are immortal, divine, and creative beings, and that all aspects of life were connected to each other through the great web of life. Early civilizations like those of Egypt and South America had relationships with their star guides who came from other planets and whom they call the Shining Ones. Such a beautiful title, the Shining Ones. And they were the teachers of these earlier civilizations. All this is emerging now, of course not taught in universities, but it's emerging through people like Nassim Haramein, who I will speak of tomorrow. So the religions of the world have taught us to believe, but they have not taught us about the divinity of our essential being and our profound relationship with the divinity of the whole universe. Materialist science has taught us that our potential and our destiny are limited to the material universe and our present state of consciousness. Both have created a kind of prison in which we live unconsciously, believing what we are told, instead of discovering who we are. So Rumi said, as long ago as the 12th century, "Why do you stay in prison when the doors are open?" The true path of science is always to explore further, to discover and understand more, and to retain the scientific method, but widen the parameters of what is explored to include what has been excluded or rejected or ridiculed as non-rational or paranormal. It would include the inner life of the cosmos as well as its outer form. So during the lunar era, we were held within a cosmic whole. And in the solar era, that whole was divided into creator and creation. We desperately need a new story, a new cosmology, and a new concept of spirit, which includes nature and the sacred feminine, if we are to create a civilization worthy of the name and discover a higher destiny and a different goal. In my next talk tomorrow, I will look at some aspects of this new story. But first, I will explore the devastating effects of the myth of the fall in greater detail. So thank you very much. I hope I haven't taken too long, but it's been a pleasure to share this with you.